The patron's first choice of the new year is the most recent addition to the Eevee family, Sylveon. Introduced in Generation 6 alongside the Fairy type, which it is one of the main representatives of, Sylveon quickly became as much of a fan favorite as any of the other evolutions, thanks to its wonderful design, from its pleasing color scheme to the ribbon-like feelers used to quell hostility. Serena also had a Sylveon in the anime, and it was one of her most important Pokemon. Today we'll be examining if Sylveon's soothing presence was welcomed in the notably harsh competitive scene. And so, we ask, how good was Sylveon actually? And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. Players were excited to use Sylveon early in XY, as its superb bulk and utility move pool, consisting of Wish and Heal Bell, seemed to be a perfect showcase for the Fairy typing and its incredible list of valuable resistances to Dragon and Fighting, two of the most threatening attacking types in the previous generation, as well as Dark, which had just lost an old resist in Steel, and even Bug. This was big for absorbing the ever-annoying U-turn. Sylveon was no passive wall either. Not only did it pack an excellent base 110 special attack stat, its stab move was not the automatic Fairy type choice of Moonblast. No, it was stronger, as it would instead use Hyper Voice, which was a normal move, but actually went hand in hand with its Pixelate ability. Normal moves would be transformed into Fairy and receive a 20% boost, meaning Sylveon packed quite a punch for a wall, with that base 110 special attack firing off a 108 base power stab. So why didn't Sylveon take off in OU? Simple. It was outclassed by Clefable, which did pretty much the exact same thing but better. Wait, you say. Clefable wasn't nearly as specially bulky as Sylveon and didn't hit nearly as hard either. Sure, it was a bit physically bulkier, but was that enough to make a difference? Well, several things. Number one, yes, the extra bulk was, in fact, a big deal. Number two, Sylveon's superior special bulk was eclipsed entirely by Clefable's two amazing abilities, which were far more suited to its role as a wall. Unaware ignored boosts, and Magic Guard's immunity to passive damage made it one of the most resilient Pokemon in the game. Plus, Sylveon's extra special defense didn't wind up making too much of a difference in practice. Number three, while Sylveon did hit harder, it didn't hit that much harder to avoid the trap many defensive Pokemon fall into, which is that of passivity, and one of the reasons it was passive was that it relied on the Wish Protect combination for recovery. Clefable could run Soft Boiled, or even Moonlight on unaware sets, for more instant healing that was not nearly as exploitable. And since it was usually running Magic Guard, it was much tougher to wear down into a position where it needed to heal, unlike Sylveon, which was provoked into healing much easier and required 2 turns to heal safely. As a result, Sylveon was outclassed. However, the novelty of it being a new Pokemon lasted throughout X and Y. Though the writing was on the wall, and players knew it was just a matter of time before it dropped to UU, it hung on for quite some time, with several players trying to make it work somehow. Even some choice spec sets were used to take advantage of the enormous potential power of Pixelate Hyper Voice. These were meant as a non-Mega alternative to Mega Gardevoir, though this was still ill-advised in nearly all cases, since Mega Gardevoir was one of the best Pokemon at tearing through OU at the time. It wasn't until quite some time into ORAS that Sylveon finally fell out of OU for good. The UU player base had been anticipating it for what seemed like forever. They were so excited for it. They held test tournaments with Sylveon allowed in the tier, and were certain it would be a great addition. But they had to wait about a year and a half after the release of ORAS for it to become a reality. They had been waiting for Sylveon since before ORAS was even announced, let alone released. And this was particularly frustrating because nobody was using Sylveon in high-level OU play. Yet less experienced players enticed by it, probably spurred on by it being an evolution, managed to keep its usage high enough to prevent its drop. Now, before we move to the saga of ORAS UU Sylveon, we must also mention that Sylveon actually had a niche in X and Y Ubers. Yes, it competed with Clefable there as well, whose unaware ability was one of many attempts to slow down the mighty Xerneas, but the tier's higher power level meant that Sylveon's far superior special defense was on full display, giving it a niche in withstanding the likes of Yveltal and Palkia, while also supporting its teammates with Wish and Heal Bell, Wish being a significant advantage over support Xerneas, which Sylveon also competed with. Sylveon also alleviated the need for Arceus Fairy, allowing players to run another Arceus form. Sylveon was a superb fit on dedicated stall teams, and was integral in holding them together against the tier's high-powered offensive onslaught. This niche was short-lived, as the primal Groudon-led power creep of ORAS meant Sylveon couldn't really be justified anymore. It didn't help that Palkia completely fell out of the metagame as a result, making it even worse, but make no mistake, Sylveon did have a genuinely good niche in X and Y Ubers, even when competing with Xerneas of all things. When all was said and done, Sylveon's true home in Generation 6 was UU, finally someplace it could settle in for the long haul. Funnily enough, this was not a certainty when it first dropped into the tier. When you think of Sylveon, you think of Defensive Wish, not exactly a Pokemon that strikes fear into players, but the player base was actually terrified of Sylveon when it first appeared. Those spec sets that had briefly been tried in OU, however ill-advised, were actually monstrous threats in the much weaker UU environment, and immediately there was talk of Sylveon's hard blasting hyper voices potentially being too much for the tier to handle. Of course, it wasn't a uniform, one-sided view of things. There was debate about whether Sylveon was even the best choice as a Specs Fairy Stab user, or if Gardevoir was, despite packing weaker Fairy Stab, with its much greater speed stat and superior coverage options. Then again, Gardevoir couldn't switch into Hydreigon's Dark Pulse like Sylveon did so effortlessly. Seeing as Hydreigon was one of the most elite Pokemon in the tier, being able to use it as an entry point was a massive selling point in Sylveon's favor. Indeed, the UU player base valued Sylveon's ability to act as an offensively minded counter to Hydreigon, but talk of the spec set being overwhelming quickly disappeared, as Sylveon's low speed prevented it from being unreasonably difficult to withstand. It was a testament to how good Sylveon was in spite of this poor speed, as it was able to hit the field and launch its attacks again and again. Spec Sylveon became a threat that defined and shaped the metagame. With sheer power, it blasted through incredibly bulky Pokemon like Suicune and Florges, while using its great bulk to find many a switch-in opportunity, and true switch-ins to it were incredibly rare. If you didn't have Blissey, you were probably in trouble. Speaking of Florges, defensive Sylveon quickly started popping up too, and it was also a tier staple for some time. However, as much as Sylveon anchored many style of teams, it came to be realized that Florges was generally the preferable choice for the role. Their differences in bulk were minimal, and Florges' ability to heal reliably in one turn with Moonlight was preferred over Sylveon's reliance on the 2-turn Wish Protect 1-2. Gen 6's mechanic, where Protect with no longer blocked Roar, meant balanced teams could be broken by provoking Sylveon into wishing, and then roaring as it failing to protect and receive its own wish. Florges' higher speed was also valued, letting it take on the incredibly dangerous Conkeldurr more easily before it was banned. Sylveon was best at that which it made its name with, its vicious Specs hyper voices, which only seemed to get more and more menacing as time went on. Some players expected the initial hype to die down, but it really wound up being more the opposite, as Sylveon continuously proved how rock solid it was. Amusingly, lack of coverage options meant it could slot Hyper Beam into its last move slot without really missing much, and getting an absurdly powerful last-ditch option for it, since remember, Hyper Beam was also affected by Pixelate, and thus was not just stab, but boosted 20%. So all in all, Sylveon was a highly significant part of ORAS UU once it finally joined the tier, and thus it had a highly eventful, successful debut generation. Sylveon didn't have much of a place in the 2014 VGC season, as the only way it could acquire Hyper Voice was through Eevee learning the move through a Black and White 2 tutor and then being transferred over, with Pokemon had to be Kalos born to qualify for VGC in 2014. But it still had a few uses thanks to the good typing and stats. Steve Eggson reached 13th with it at the German Nationals, Andrew Kavanaugh reached 12th at the US Nationals, and Jan Mitchell-Berger impressively reached 25th at Worlds, but it wasn't really part of the metagame. However, in 2015, it gained access to Hyper Voice via the ORAS move tutor and instantly became a huge part of the metagame. Hyper Voice wasn't just a spread move, it was a boosted spread move that hit several of the biggest threats in the metagame super effectively and smacked the many neutral targets as well, and came from a defensively robust Pokemon capable of withstanding all manner of hits at that. Despite its low natural defense, it could be Eevee to survive Mega Kangaskhan's Mighty Return and Talonflame's Choice Banded Brave Bird, while it naturally survived Aegislash's Flash Cannon without any help at all. Then it would strike back in return with brutally powerful Hyper Voices, by far most commonly boosted with Choice Specs, though Pixie Plate and sometimes Life Orb were also effective for the power they gave while allowing Sylveon to maintain more flexibility. But most of the time, you didn't want to be using anything but Hyper Voice and wanted to wring every bit of strength possible out of it. So Specs was the go-to, especially since Life Orb cut into Sylveon's survivability. That said, Sylveon could also pull off some nice team support with Helping Hand, making for an incredibly hard-hitting team overall. This was especially nice since Sylveon loved pairing with Mega Charizard Y for its ability to scare away the steals that would threaten Sylveon, and the two made for a brutal pairing of incredibly strong spread moves. Such helping hand sets could use Citrus Berry to improve its hit-taking capability. Sylveon was a fierce, dominant force capable of slotting on nearly any type of team, and Sylveon being as good as it was meant it got spammed a lot. So we will only be listing first place finishes for regionals, top 4 placements at nationals, and top cut at worlds, as well as any sets that were particularly innovative. The following players won their respective regionals with Sylveon: Carson St. Dennis at Florida in the senior division, Colin Hare at Wisconsin, Juan Nar at Colombia, Kenny Lee in Singapore, who even had a Sylveon mirror match in the finals versus Nicholas Ong, Riley Factura at Seattle, Chris Giagozoglo at Melbourne, Michael Garrett at Kansas, and Alberto Lara at California and Utah. Then Blake Hopper reached top 4 at the US Nationals, Theron Ho reached 2nd at the Australian Nationals, Dominic Schaefer reached 2nd at the Italian Nationals, and Marcus Statter won the UK Nationals. At Worlds, Theron brought Sylveon to place 23rd with it, and Yosuke Isage used Sylveon and came in 3rd. 2016 saw Sylveon all but fall out of the metagame, as it failed to truly find a niche in a tier so dominated by the restricted Pokemon, none of which it did well against, but it did have one placement. Alistair Sandover used it to win the Perth Regionals. So all in all, Sylveon's 2015 season was an enormous one, marking it as a VGC success. Sylveon returned to UU in Generation 7. The tier was much faster and stronger now, so its spec set was a thing of the past, unable to find enough opportunity to throw out its attacks in this new metagame. Defensive Sylveon, on the other hand, became a more important part of the metagame. It competed with Florges once more, and was severely outclassed by Florges when Como-O was in the tier, as Como-O's soundproof ability blocked Hyper Voice, meaning Sylveon was hapless against a Pokemon you needed your Fairy type to check. However, once Como-O left, there was no longer much of a gap at all between the two Fairy types. If one was preferred, it was not by much of a margin, and usually boiled down to player on team preference. Each Pokemon carried over its advantages and disadvantages from the previous generation, but there were also new dynamics at play in this iteration of UU, which meant Sylveon had many more important reasons to be used than before. First off, using Hyper Voice as stab meant it was much better at dealing with Kyurem, because the move, being sound-based, bypassed Substitute. Kyurem loved PP stalling its checks with Substitute and Roost in conjunction with Pressure, and Florges could quickly find itself in a difficult spot from which Kyurem could spiral out of control. But Sylveon tolerated no such nonsense from the Ice Dragon. Additionally, Sylveon's higher defense stat was valuable in withstanding Side Shocks, the terrifying Latias, one of the best Pokemon in the tier, as was the fact that its Hyper Voices hit it much harder in return. While not a true answer to Terrakion and Mega Altaria, two more of the tier's biggest threats, Sylveon also leveraged both of these advantages to help check them far better than Florges did as well. So overall, Sylveon's presence in Gen 7 UU was not flashy or particularly large, but it was a solid, useful piece of the tier, marking another successful generation for it. In a strange, unexpected mirror of Generation 6, Sylveon actually started Gen 8 off in OU for quite some time despite Clefable existing. However, this time there was a better reason than it's the new evolution. It was the fact that it was the most reliable Kyurem counter available, a major advantage over Clefable. Not only did its Hyper Voices rip through any irritating sub-Kyurem sets a la Gen 7 UU, but Sylveon's much higher special defense also made it much better at withstanding Specs Ice Beams. This was a solid niche, given how badly Kyurem was messing up the tier, but Clefable was just so much better at everything else that Sylveon eventually fell out of favor and dropped to UU. Early Gen 8 UU only had two real answers to ground moves, Golisopod and Noivern. There was also Rotom Wash, technically, but functionally it didn't work because the threat at hand was Choice Band Haxorus, which almost anticipated terrestrialization by practically becoming a ground type. It would literally just spam Earthquake. Forget its Dragon Stab because EQ decked the entire tier. Well, unless you wanted to risk sending in Noivern and get completely obliterated. And then Sylveon dropped to UU and saved the metagame from its plight at the hands of Haxorus. Sylveon was of course completely unbothered by Dragonclaw and Outrage, and it had the bulk to withstand Earthquake. UU exhaled, relieved, and things seemed peaceful until Haxorus used Poison Jab, which sadly Sylveon failed to withstand. It was at this point Haxorus was banned. However, as luck would have it, Sylveon was far more than just an anti-Haxorus machine. It was a superb Pokemon in its own right. It completely countered the tier's best Pokemon, Nguyen, and the tier's best steals are Cobalion and Dual Blade, neither of which had longevity or wanted to take Pixelate Hyper Voices at all. Thus, Sylveon was quite threatening with just its standard Wish variants, which took on a huge portion of the tier, and also enabled offensive teams not just in defensive stability it provided them without really slowing their pace or ability to hit hard, but also in that it gave them much valued relief against status and Heal Bell. Additionally, Sylveon had picked up Mystical Fire as coverage in Gen 8, which was outstanding coverage alongside Hyper Voice. So outstanding, in fact, that offensive Calm Mind Sylveon came into existence and started ripping through the tier more immediately, with steals even more unable to withstand it. This variant of Sylveon was such a threat that it no longer found itself just on the bulky offense, balance, and defensive teams it had always been associated with. Now, its instant danger level was such that it was even used on hyper-offensive sticky web teams, where it was a perfect fit. Not only did webs solve the issue of Sylveon's speed, making it even more dangerous, but Sylveon also solved the issue web's teams had of getting trucked by Nguyen. Whether it was substitute Calm Mind with leftovers or rest Calm Mind with a Chesto offensive Sylveon was a terror. Sylveon was a UU superstar throughout Pokemon Home and the Isle of Armor. Sadly, the Crown Tundra came along, dumped an SS and load of power creep everywhere, and suddenly Sylveon found itself quite unmatched in a UU metagame populated by monsters like Celesteela. Cruelly, it couldn't even find itself a role in PU, tumbling down to NU. Fortunately there, it became among the metagame's most consistent Pokemon. With its standard Wish Protect set, it took on an absolutely enormous portion of the metagame, much like it had in early UU, stifling common dangerous attackers in Scrafty, Guzzlord, Inteleon, Starmie, and Passimian, while reinforcing the longevity of its defensive partners Guzzlord and Copperajah with its sizable wishes and status-removing Heal Bells. It was quite difficult to take advantage of for such a defensive Pokemon too, which made it all the better. Huge wall breakers like Exploud and Tyrantrum would have their choice moves scouted by Protect, while Heal Bell was hardly mandatory, and thus Mystical Fire could be slotted into utterly ruinous Scavalier switch-ins, thinking themselves safe, while messing with Vileplume as well. This set rocketed Sylveon to elite status within NU. Sylveon wasn't just relegated to walling either, and offensive variants quickly proved their mettle. Its spec set in particular came roaring back with a vengeance. Sure, the tier was in no short supply of fairy resist, but Sylveon's hyper voices were so strong it got by through sheer muscle, with further help from Psyshock and Mystical Fire's coverage. With how sparse its move pool was, Sylveon could even run Heal Bell in the last slot effectively. All in all though, bulky Sylveon was its bread and butter that made it an NU defining staple, as it fully took advantage of Sylveon's many amazing attributes that let it tower over most of the competition. Generation 8 was an absolutely excellent one for Sylveon. With the Tapus gone, Sylveon returned to the VGC scene in a major way in 2020, becoming a dominant Pokemon once again. It's pulled its usual Hyper Voice tricks with one major difference. Instead of being hell-bent on spamming Specs Hyper Voice, now it preferred other items like Pixie Plate because it needed to be able to switch moves more. Specifically, it wanted to use Quick Attack. Why such a weak move? Well, because it would use it on its Dynamaxed very weak teammates holding weakness policy, such as Tyranitar, to give them a safe, massive boost to their power, letting them unleash enormous damage on the opponent. And they would be doing this while Sylveon was also barraging the opponent with its famous Hyper Voices. It was a difficult combo to withstand and proved massively successful. Of course, Quick Attack also came with the excellent benefit of finishing off Focus Sash Pokemon, or despite its low power, low health Pokemon in general, weak as it was still Pixelate boosted stab. Sylveon's usage was once again very high, so we'll be sticking with top 4 placement. Using Sylveon, the following players achievements were as such. Alex Soto reached second at the Bochum Regionals, Marco Jimenza Caladura Silva won the Melbourne Internationals, Andrew Ding won the Illinois Regionals, Maddie Morgan reached fourth at the Malmo Regionals, and finally Christopher Kahn reached second at Perth Regionals. Sadly, Sylveon fell out of viability and usage once the Isle of Armor came around. It was replaced by Primarina, another fairy-type Hyper Voice spammer, which was better equipped to take on the new metagame. Sylveon's only placement was Ismail Arab, who reached second at the Galar Circuit. Then the Crown Tundra came along, the Tapus returned, and well, Sylveon didn't completely disappear, but it wasn't exactly common either. Its placements included Yuya Tada reaching top 4 at the second Players Cup Oceania qualifier, Emma Monzo reached third in the third Hatterene series with an inventive Babiri Berry Mystical Fire set to turn the tables on steals, Binji Wang reaching 6th at the Victory Road Grand Circuit Spring series, also with the Babiri Berry set, and Evan Wang reaching 9th at the Asia Asia Players Cup Singapore qualifier. It wasn't the most impactful, but hey, Sylveon still found true excellence at the beginning of the 2020 VGC season. Once again, Sylveon saw OU usage at the beginning of the generation, though this time around it was incredibly sparse, not enough to warrant actual OU status, and it wasn't acting as a discount Clefable. No, it was taking advantage of Fairy Terrestrialization on its choice spec set to bombard the opponent with utterly ludicrous levels of power. It was not a commonly seen piece of the metagame, but it did see the tiniest handfuls of usage in tournament play, so it had to be mentioned. Sylveon's real place though has been in RU. At the time of this video's making, it has just dropped into NU with the New Year's tier shifts, but so far in Gen 9, it has been an RU Pokemon that occasionally showed up in UU, doing its usual thing, either Wish Protect or Choice Specs. Its Wish variants are different now though, as Sylveon lost both Heal Bell and Mystical Fire in Gen 9. A blow to be sure, but the silver lining is that Sylveon now runs Calm Mind in that last slot of a lack of better options, and as it turns out, Sylveon is a superb Calm Mind sweeper with Terrestrialization. It loves terrestrializing into a Steel type, becoming the Steel evolution we've all dreamed of, and in doing so becomes incredibly difficult to break. It also has the option of running Terra Blast as its one attack, as if it didn't Terra, it would still have Terra Blast as a strong stab move thanks to Pixelate. And if it did Terra into a fire or ground type to destroy Steels, then it had Terra Blast for that too. In UU, Sylveon was always good, not great, hence why it was RU simultaneously, and in RU it was solid but not flashy. It competed with Florges once again, but Florges' lower physical bulk meant it was far less capable of taking over battles like a Terra Calm Mind Sylveon could, and Florges had lost aromatherapy as well. Thus, Sylveon proved itself so superior that Florges eventually dropped to NU. Sylveon finally getting the last word in. It remains to be seen how Sylveon will perform in NU going forward, but it's already had a good generation with its performances thus far. Early Generation 9 VGC demanded use of good spread moves, and what's better than Sylveon's Hyper Voice? It burst onto the scene with a variety of excellent sets. Substitute, Helping Hand, Quick Attack a la Gen 8, and while most of these ran Throat Spray, there was also of course the classic Choice Specs variant. With Terra Water or Fire, Sylveon could also turn the tables on would-be checks like Goldengo and brandish excellent coverage in Terra Blast. Sylveon was one of the very best Pokemon around and boasted immense usage once again, so we have limited its regional placements to top 5. They were as follows: Emilio Forbes reaching 5th at the San Diego Regionals, James Evans reaching 3rd at Orlando, and Zachary Thornbird reaching 5th at Vancouver and Charlotte. Sadly, Sylveon has fallen off with the arrival of the new metagames. Recalling its situation in Gen 8, it's very, very good early on, but when stronger Pokemon get added, it can't keep up, as has been evidenced by its lack of placements since Regulation B's addition of Paradox Pokemon like Fluttermane and Regulation C's edition of the Treasures of Ruin. In spite of this, Sylveon's still seen a couple of placements. Most notably, it won Worlds in the Senior Division in the expert hands of Tomoya Ogawa from Japan, using a Specs Sleep Talk set. Its boosted Hyper Voices were crucial in the deciding series, so Sylveon wasn't just along for the ride. It was a central figure in bringing the championship home. Additionally, Jimmy Frido recently reached 30th at the Toronto Regionals for the 2024 season. Maybe there's hope for it yet. And that's it. So how good was Sylveon actually? Well, it's had an amazing competitive career. Despite not being true OU material, it's actually featured in OU quite a bit. In fact, far longer than anyone expected, especially in its debut generation, where the reason was mostly hype for it being the new evolution. However, eventually it saw some use of its own merits, though it of course always wound up falling from OU. It's featured in UU in every generation and was a staple of the tier in Gen 6 and 7, while excelling in the tier's early iteration in Gen 8 before going on to excel in NU. So far in Gen 9, it's already featured in UU, RU, and now is set to repeat itself in NU. It's a quintessential lower tier Pokemon. Its fairy typing and access to either Big Wishes or Specs Pixelate Hyper Voices always finds some niche somewhere. It's also briefly featured in X and Y Ubers. Sylveon's also had a great deal of VGC success, with its Hyper Voice being one of the best spread move in the game, resulting in a tremendously successful 2015 season, which had followed up with success in early Gens 8 and 9. So overall, Sylveon has been a great competitive Pokemon and a solid addition to the Eevee family. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And if you like the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Sylveon? Would you buff it? Would you nerf it? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And follow Maikiri on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.